the electron is passed from one electron carrier to another, isn't it? And at the end of the day, the electron is being accepted by the final electron acceptor, which is oxygen. So if you can see here in this electron transport chain, we are not yet produced any ATP, isn't it? We not yet produce any ATP. In this process of electron transport chain is just a process to transport the electrons, and once the electron is being transferred or transported from one molecule to another, a small amount of energy will be released. Okay, small amount of energy will be released when the electron is being transported from one carrier to another carrier. But in this process, no ATP is being produced yet. No ATP is being produced yet. How is it that we are going to produce ATP? Contributed by this electron transport chain. So here comes the chemiosmosis. The chemiosmosis is the process where it will couple. This chemiosmosis, it will couple with the ETC, and when it coupled with ETC, then only we can produce the ATP. Okay. So the ATC makes no ATP directly. Instead, it eases the fall of electrons from food to oxygen, breaking a large free energy drop into a series of smaller steps that release energy in manageable amounts. Okay, so how does the mitochondria couple electron transport and energy release to ATP synthesis? So this is what we call chemiosmosis. So chemiosmosis is the process which use the energy released from the process of transportation of the electrons that happening in the electron transport chain just now in order to produce ATP. So I repeat, just now we learned about electron transport chain. During electron transport chain, electrons are being transported from one molecule to another. So when the electron is transported from one molecule to another, that's the energy will be released. There's a small amount of energy will be released. That energy release will then be used to power ATP synthesis. That energy will then be used to produce ATP, and that is the second process called the chemiosmosis. So overall, the electron transport chain will be coupled together with this process of chemiosmosis, and then only ATP will be produced, and the whole thing is called oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so just to revise you guys, the structure of mitochondria, matrix, there's a mitochondrial matrix in the mitochondria and the cristae here, which is the enfolding of the inner membrane of the electron transport chain. So this cristae is where located the 1,000 copies of the ETC, isn't it? And then you can see here, this is the outer membrane, and this is the inner membrane. And in between the inner membrane and the outer membrane and the inner membrane, there's a space. Okay, ada ruangan space, and that is called intermembrane space. Okay, so chemiosmosis, we are going to talk about inner membrane, we are going to talk about intermembrane space, we are going to talk about matrix. That's why you should have in your mind right now the location of all these three, so that you can understand the process of chemiosmosis. Okay, so what is for the chemiosmosis? So in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, there are many copies of ATP synthase. Okay, what is ATP synthase? It is the enzyme that makes ATP, okay, from ADP and inorganic phosphate. Okay, you see in this diagram. Okay, you see in this diagram, this is the inner membrane, right? This is the inner membrane. So embedded in the inner membrane is the electron transport chain. You can see here complex number 1, this is complex number 3, and this is complex number 4. Okay, if you see here at the nearby of the ETC, you can see this one enzyme. Okay, this one enzyme. This is ATP synthase. Okay, this ATP synthase located near to the ETC, also embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So this enzyme is the one that will catalyze the production of ATP. You can see here in this diagram, ATP is produced here. So ATP is produced here by how? By the phosphorylation of ADP. ADP combines with phosphate group here, and we got the ATP here. So the production of ATP here catalyzed by the enzyme ATP synthase located nearby the electron transport chain. Okay, this is the location here. You can see clearly all of these embedded in your inner membrane of mitochondria. Okay, and then you can see the location on top here is the intermembrane space. And then at the bottom here, this is the mitochondrial matrix. This is the mitochondrial matrix. So mitochondrial matrix is here, the inner membrane is here, and the intermembrane space is here. Okay. Okay. So this is electron transport chain. You can see complex 1 here, coenzyme Q here, complex 3 here, cytochrome C here, and complex 4 here. You can see the arrow here. The arrow here showing electron is being transported by the electron carrier in the electron transport chain. This is electron transport chain. Component number 1 here. This is component number 1, electron transport chain. And coupled with electron transport chain is the chemiosmosis. Okay, this is the chemiosmosis, where chemiosmosis is the ATP synthesis powered by the flow of proton back across the membrane, and the whole thing is called oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so how is this happening? Okay, the power source for ATP synthase is the proton gradient. Okay, what is gradient? Gradient is kecerunan. Gradient is kecerunan, means the difference in the concentration of proton on opposite sides of the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, the process where energy coupling mechanism uses energy stored in the form of proton gradient across a membrane to power ATP synthesis is chemiosmosis. Okay, what is chemiosmosis? Again, it is a process and energy coupling mechanism uses energy stored in the form of a proton gradient across a membrane to power ATP synthesis. Okay, so this is chemiosmosis. Okay, chemiosmosis actually comes from the word chemical and osmosis. If you still remember, osmosis, you learn. What is osmosis? Osmosis means the flow. You guys have learned osmosis is the process of the flow of water molecule, isn't it? Process of water molecule movement from high energy concentration region to the lower energy concentration region. That's osmosis. But in this case, we are not talking about water. We are talking about proton. Okay, we are talking about proton. That's why it is called chemiosmosis. Osmosis is the flow of, if we learn osmosis, flow of water, but here it's not water, flow of chemical. The chemical here is proton. So it's flow of proton across the membrane. What membrane? The inner membrane of mitochondria. So this is the chemiosmosis lah. Okay. Okay, how is it that the proton gradient can be formed? How is it that the proton gradient can be formed in the inner membrane? So the energy for the gradient formation comes from the exergonic redox reactions in the ETC. Okay, as electrons pass through the ETC, a series of exergonic reactions release small amounts of energy. Just now I just said, when the electron pass in from one molecule to another in the ETC, there's a small amount of energy will be released. Okay, and that small amount of energy will then used to establish this proton gradient. Okay, establish this proton gradient across the inner membrane of mitochondria. Okay, you see the diagram here. Okay, you can see the diagram here. You see this arrow, NADH plus the electrons to complex 1, right? And then NADH will become reduced to NAD plus. Okay, once the electron are passed to complex 1, and then some energy will be released. Okay, once the electron is being transferred, energy will be released, and that energy will be used to pump proton from the mitochondrial matrix to intermembrane space. So you can see the pink arrow here. The pink arrow here show the complex 1 pump proton from mitochondrial matrix to intermembrane space. Okay, into the intermembrane space. Okay, and then the electron here pass the electron from the complex 1 pass to coenzyme Q, and then coenzyme Q pass the electrons to complex 3. Once the electron pass from the coenzyme Q to complex 3, another energy will be released, and that energy will be used by the complex 3 to pump proton again from the mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. Okay, so next, electron pass to cytochrome C, and then cytochrome C pass the electrons to complex 4. This is complex 4. And again, once the electron is transported to the complex 4, some energy will be released, and that energy will be used by complex 4 to pump proton from mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. Okay, why is it that the complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4 needs the energy to pump the proton? Because this proton actually is transported or pumped from the area of lower concentration proton region to high concentration proton region. So intermembrane space, the concentration of proton is much higher compared to in the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, so mitochondrial matrix have low concentration of proton. Intermembrane space have high concentration of proton. So you can see that this proton, they are being transported from the region of lower concentration to the region of higher concentration. So this is an active transport because the substances move against its concentration gradient. So when when the proton here need to move against its concentration gradient, it needs energy. Okay, it needs energy. That's why where the energy comes from. So the energy comes from the electron transfer in the ETC. Okay, electron transfer in the ETC. So that's why we say the electron transport chain couple with this pumping proton process, because the proton now move against its concentration gradient. So when the proton is transferred from one molecule to another, energy will be released. That energy used by complex number 1, complex number 3, and complex number 4 to pump proton from mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. Okay, so with this continuous process, this will establish a proton gradient. That means the intermembrane space, there will be forever higher concentration of proton, and in the mitochondrial matrix, they will be forever lower concentration of proton. So because there's a different concentration of proton in the mitochondrial matrix compared to the intermembrane space, that's why there's a gradient here, kecerunan here. Okay, so that's why there's a kecerunan here. Kecerunan means one area having higher concentration, another area having lower concentration. What concentration? Concentration of proton. Which area having higher proton? Intermembrane space. Which area having lower concentration of proton? Mitochondrial matrix. That means there is a proton gradient across the inner membrane of mitochondria. One area is higher, another area is lower. Okay, so electron transport chain establish the proton gradient. So I repeat the explanation back. As complexes 1, 3, and 4 accept and then donate electrons, they use the exergonic flow of electrons to pump the proton from where? From the mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. Okay, again you see here, this one shown by the pink arrow here. The pink arrow here. Okay, the proton is being pumped from the mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space by complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4. Okay, thus intermembrane space contains higher concentration of proton compared to the matrix. So this will give a difference in the proton concentration. Because of this difference in the proton concentration, that's why this creates a proton gradient. Okay, proton gradient, which is the electrochemical gradient across the inner membrane. Okay, So what is very important about this gradient? Why is it that we need to establish this gradient? Why is this gradient of proton is very important? Okay, so by now you should know the electron transport chain establish proton gradient. Okay, by now you should know electron transport chain establish proton gradient. How? Because during the electron transport chain, when the electron is being transported, some energy is being released, and that energy used by complex 1, 3, and 4 to pump proton from mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space, and that at the end creates a proton gradient where proton concentration in the mitochondrial matrix is lower than the proton concentration in the intermembrane space. So now, by now, you should already know that that's the proton gradient established here. Next is, what is it? Why is it that this proton gradient is important? Okay, next question is, why is it this proton gradient is important? Okay, so this proton gradient actually, it will give a force ataupun daya force where we call it as a proton motive force. Okay, proton motive force. So proton gradient across the inner membrane has a potential energy. This gradient, they have potential energy. They have energy. And this energy is referred to as the proton motive force. Okay. What is this? This is the capacity of the gradient to power the ATP synthesis. Okay. So because of this proton gradient, we can at the end having this ATP production. Okay. So to be simplistic, ATP production is being powered by this proton gradient. It's being powered by this proton gradient. Okay. Okay. If you see here, what happened to this proton when it is being pumped into the intermembrane space? Okay. You see in this diagram, where does the proton goes? Where does the proton goes? You see this pink arrow. You can see that the proton here, they move here, and then they move through the ATP synthase back to the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, this proton, they diffuse back. Actually, what happened is that they diffuse back into the mitochondrial matrix, but they just not diffuse simply through the plasma membrane like that. No, they diffuse back across the membrane, but through the ATP synthase. Okay, why we say diffuse? Why we say diffuse? Why we say diffuse? Because this is a diffusion. Why is this is diffusion? Because as what we know just now, the concentration of proton in intermembrane space is higher compared to the concentration of proton in the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, so that's why this is a diffusion process. This is a passive process where the proton will move following its concentration gradient from the intermembrane space back into the mitochondrial matrix, but they will move through the ATP synthase, which is the enzyme. Okay, and once they diffuse back into the mitochondrial matrix, this ATP synthase will use the energy that brought by this proton, use the energy to phosphorylate the ADP, and then at the end we got the ATP here. Okay, so you guys remember phosphorylation? In order for us to form the ATP, okay, the ADP needs to bind with phosphate, isn't it? But the ADP, they cannot just bind to phosphate like that. They need energy. Okay, ADP needs energy in order for the phosphate to bind to it. So where does this energy come from? So this energy comes from the proton flow through this ATP synthase. Okay, so I repeat, all these proton in the intermembrane space, because this is higher concentration of proton region, this proton will diffuse back into the mitochondrial matrix, but through the ATP synthase, and ATP synthase will use the energy to phosphorylate the ADP. ADP binds to phosphate group. This phosphate group is, you can see here, it's written here PI. PI means inorganic phosphate. It's the phosphate that is in the surrounding, okay, in the surrounding of the matrix. So ATP synthase will use the energy to phosphorylate the ADP, and the ADP will become the ATP, and this is the ATP that we want at the end of the day, right? So the proton, okay, let's see the wording together. The proton has a tendency to move back across the membrane, diffusing down gradient. So the force that drives the proton flow back across the membrane into the mitochondrial matrix through the proton channel in ATP synthase. Okay, so this ATP synthase, they have the proton channel. Okay, and this proton will move through this proton channel, and once they move, the energy used by the ATP synthase to phosphorylate ADP forming the ATP. So ATP synthase harness the proton motive force to phosphorylate ADP, and then ADP binds with the phosphate group and form the ATP. So the ATP is synthesized. Okay, so that's all. That's how actually we have the ATP at the end of this process of oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so that's all for the proton motive force. That is chemiosmosis. So overall, you see this diagram. I will repeat again to summarize again. You see oxidative phosphorylation comprised of two components. One is electron transport chain, and another one is chemiosmosis. Okay, what is electron transport chain? You see here, electron transport and pumping of protons create an proton gradient across the membrane. This is the first component of oxidative phosphorylation, electron transport chain. Electron transport chain means electron is being transported through the ETC. Once the electron is being transported, energy released from the electrons, and that energy release used by complex number 1, by complex number 3, and complex number 4 to pump proton from mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. When this pumping of proton happens, this will create proton gradient across the membrane. That's why it says here, electron transport and pumping of proton, which create and proton gradient across the membrane. What does it mean by proton gradient? Proton gradient means one area having higher proton concentration, another area having lower proton concentration. Which one having higher proton concentration is in the intermembrane space, okay? And mitochondrial matrix having lower proton concentration. Okay, so because intermembrane space having higher proton concentration compared to mitochondrial matrix having lower proton concentration, so this establish a gradient. What gradient? A proton gradient. Okay, so what is the importance of this proton gradient? So that comes the chemiosmosis, where ATP synthesis powered by the flow of proton back across the membrane. So because of this, because of the proton gradient established, okay, so proton concentration is higher in the intermembrane space, and proton concentration is lower in the mitochondrial space. Mitochondrial matrix. So this causing the proton in the intermembrane space, okay, tend to diffuse back into the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, they will this proton in the intermembrane space tend to diffuse back into the mitochondrial matrix across the inner mitochondrial membrane. So when they want to diffuse back, they will diffuse through the ATP synthase, which having the proton channel. So once the proton diffuse through the ATP synthase will use or harness the energy bring by the flow of the proton, and that energy used subsequently to phosphorylate the ADP. So the ADP managed to bind with the phosphate, and at the end we got the ATP here. Okay, so that's why the whole thing, the overall thing, starting from the electron being transported in the electron transport chain, and goes to the energy release, and goes to the proton pumping, and goes to the proton gradient establishment, and then followed by the chemiosmosis, which is the flow of proton across the membrane, from intermembrane space into the mitochondrial matrix. The whole thing then contribute to the production of ATP, catalyzed by the enzyme ATP synthase. Okay, so I hope that you guys understand. So this whole thing is called oxidative phosphorylation. So you guys remember, in order for us to produce the ATP through the oxidative phosphorylation, we cannot depend on electron transport chain alone, or we cannot depend on the chemiosmosis alone. But we have to depend on both electron transport chain together with the chemiosmosis to make up the whole process of oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so my summary is that I want to stress, in order for us to make ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, we have to depend on both electron transport chain together with the chemiosmosis. Then the whole thing then only can produce ATP at the end. All right, I hope that you guys understand. If you're not sure, not really clear, you can after this you can read back. And then you may your understanding will be enhanced lah once you read back the notes. Okay, so that's all. So now questions time. You guys answer this question first, then only we end our lecture. Okay, now let's answer this together. Number 1.
Synthase.
Okay, chemiosmosis in the membrane of the material, there are many copies of ATP synthase. Okay, correct. Next, the power source for the ATP synthase is a proton
Gradient.
Proton gradient, correct. Proton gradient, which is the difference in concentration of proton on opposite sides of the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, this process, chemiosmosis, is the energy coupling mechanism that uses energy stored in the form of a proton
Gradient.
correct, across a membrane to power ATP.
Synthase.
No. To power ATP
Synthesis.
to power ATP synthesis. Okay. Okay, now, how does the proton gradient form across the inner membrane? Okay, the energy for gradient formation comes from the hexagonic
redox
reactions in the ETC. As electron pass through the ETC, a series of hexagonic reactions release a small amount of
Energy.
correct? Okay, electron transport chain establish the proton gradient as complex 1, 3, and 4 accept and donate electrons. They use the hexagonic flow of electrons to
Proton.
To what?
Pump.
To pump proton from mitochondrial matrix into
Intermembrane.
intermembrane
space.
Okay, intermembrane space. Does intermembrane space contain a higher concentration of proton than the
Mitochondrial matrix.
Giving a difference in the proton
Concentration.
concentration. This creates a proton
Gradient.
gradient. Good. Okay. Proton gradient has a potential energy, and this energy is referred to
Proton motive forces.
proton motive force. Good. The capacity of the gradient to power ATP
Synthesis.
by the ATP synthase, correct? The proton has a tendency to move back, diffusing down the gradient. The force that drives proton flow back across the membrane into the mitochondrial matrix through the proton channel in ATP
Synthase.
ATP
Synthase.
correct. Okay, ATP synthase harness the protein morphifos to phosphorylate
ADP.
phosphorylate
ADP.
Okay, phosphorylate. Okay. ADP. So ADP will ATP is
Synthesize.
Synthesize. Okay, correct.
Synthesize.
Yeah, synthesize. Okay, last one. Together, electron transport and chemiosmosis mix up
Oxidation phosphorylation. Oxidative
oxi
phosphorylation.
oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, correct. All right, thank you.